At 65, she lost everything, but a forgotten payment led her to something no one knew existed. The office was colder than it should have been, not from the air, but from the silence that followed her last signature. Outside, the world kept moving, cars passing, people talking, while Evelyn Harper stood there with nothing left but a folder and a long drive ahead. By sunset, she'd be back in a place she thought she'd left for good, and about to notice something that didn't belong. If you were in her place, would you go back, or start somewhere completely new? The office was colder than it needed to be. Evelyn Harper noticed that first. Not the papers, not the man across from her. Just the air. It hummed faintly through a vent above the door, dry and steady, like it had been running all day without stopping. The kind of cold that wasn't meant for comfort, just function. She kept her coat on. The attorney sat across the small desk, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes fixed on the documents between them. He had introduced himself 10 minutes earlier, but she had already forgotten his name. Not out of disrespect, just nothing about this moment felt worth holding on to. "Mrs. Harper," he said, clearing his throat softly, "if you'll initial here, and then sign at the bottom." His voice was careful, measured, like he had done this many times and learned not to sound too involved. Evelyn nodded once. She picked up the pen. It was heavier than she expected. Metal, cool against her fingers. She rolled it once between her thumb and index finger, feeling the weight of it. Then she lowered it to the paper. The first line. Her initials. Small, neat. Still precise even now. She moved to the next. And the next. The room stayed quiet except for the faint scratch of ink and the steady hum above them. Somewhere beyond the closed door, a phone rang once, then stopped. Footsteps passed. Someone laughed briefly in the distance. It all felt far away, like another building entirely. Evelyn didn't rush. She read each line, even though she already knew what they said. She had read them last night, and the night before. Sitting at a borrowed kitchen table in an apartment that didn't feel like hers, going over every word until the meaning blurred. Liquidation of assets. Final settlement, outstanding liabilities, words that used to belong to other people, other situations, never hers. Until now. "Take your time," the attorney added, though she hadn't asked. She didn't respond, just turned the page. There was a moment halfway down where her hand paused, not because she didn't understand, because she did. Everything she had built over 40 years, gone in language that fit neatly into margins, a lifetime reduced to paragraphs that didn't raise their voice. She pressed the pen down again. Signed, Evelyn Harper. The name looked the same as it always had. Clean, controlled, no shaking, no hesitation. She lifted the pen and set it carefully beside the paper, aligning it with the edge of the desk without thinking. A habit from years of keeping order in classrooms, in offices, in places where small details mattered. The attorney glanced up, just briefly, as if checking for something. A reaction, maybe. A crack in her composure. He didn't find one. "All right," he said quietly, pulling the documents toward him. "That completes the filing." Completes. The word landed without weight. Evelyn folded her hands in her lap. Her fingers felt slightly stiff, but steady. She could hear her own breathing, slow, even, the way she used to steady herself before walking into a difficult parent meeting. or standing in front of a room full of students on the first day of school. Same rhythm. Inhale, exhale. Across from her, the attorney began stacking the papers into a folder. He worked quickly now, businesslike, efficient, the moment already behind him. For what it's worth, he said, not looking up, these situations are more common than people think. Evelyn tilted her head just slightly. She wasn't offended or comforted, just aware. She had trusted someone. That was the simple version, the version that didn't need explaining. A colleague, years of working side by side, shared decisions, shared conversations about the future. He had spoken in numbers she understood, plans that made sense. He had looked her in the eye and said it was solid. She had believed him. Not blindly, not carelessly, just fully. And that had been enough. The attorney snapped the folder shut. If you have any questions moving forward, you can contact my office, he said. We'll provide copies of everything. Evelyn nodded again. She stood slowly, smoothing the front of her coat with both hands. The fabric was worn at the cuffs, but clean. She had always taken care of her things. Still did. Thank you, she said. Her voice sounded normal. That surprised her more than anything. The attorney gave a small, polite smile, the kind that didn't ask for anything in return. You're welcome. She turned toward the door. Her hand rested on the handle for a second before she opened it. Not hesitation, just a pause. Like standing at the edge of something you can't quite see yet. Then she stepped out. The hallway was warmer. Fluorescent lights stretched overhead, casting a flat, steady glow across beige walls and carpet that had seen better years. A woman stood near a copier, flipping through a stack of papers. A man leaned against the wall, scrolling through his phone. No one looked at Evelyn. No one knew. And why would they? She walked down the hallway at an even pace, her shoes making soft, regular sounds against the carpet. At the end, a glass door led outside. Sunlight spilled through it, bright and sharp compared to the muted interior. She pushed it open. The heat hit her immediately. Phoenix in the afternoon, dry, unforgiving, the kind of heat that wrapped around you and didn't let go. Evelyn stepped onto the sidewalk and stood there for a moment. Cars moved along the street. A bus passed, its brakes hissing. Somewhere nearby, a construction crew shouted to each other over the noise of machinery. Life continued. Exactly as it had been. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the folded copy of the documents. The paper was still crisp, edges clean. She looked at it for a second, then folded it again, smaller this time, and slipped it back into her pocket. As if making it more compact might make it easier to carry. She didn't cry. Not here, not in the office, not on the sidewalk. There was no sudden wave, no breaking point, just a quiet, steady absence. Like a room that had been emptied slowly, one piece at a time, until you finally noticed the echo. Evelyn adjusted her grip on her bag and began walking toward the parking lot. Each step felt the same as the one before, measured, deliberate, certain. Behind her, the glass door closed with a soft click. And just like that, everything she had built was no longer hers. But the world didn't stop. It didn't even pause. It just kept moving, as if nothing had changed at all. Evelyn stood in the parking lot a moment longer than necessary, her hand still resting on the strap of her bag. Cars pulled in and out, Doors opened, closed. A man laughed into his phone as he crossed behind her. The world carried on with a kind of quiet certainty she couldn't quite step back into. She found her car where she had left it that morning. A faded silver sedan, 10 years old, clean but worn in the places that mattered, the driver's seat slightly softened, the steering wheel smooth from years of use. It had been paid off years ago. One of the few things that hadn't been touched. She opened the door and slid inside. The heat had settled into the seats, into the air, into everything. It wrapped around her the moment she closed the door. She didn't turn the engine on right away, just sat there, hands resting lightly on the wheel. The documents in her coat pocket felt heavier now, not physically, just present. She reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a folded road map, paper, creased along familiar lines. She had kept it there out of habit, even after the car had been fitted with a digital system she rarely trusted. She unfolded it slowly across the steering wheel. Phoenix spread out beneath her fingers in neat grids and labeled streets. But her eyes didn't stay there. They moved east, then further, past the larger cities, into thinner lines, fewer names. Until they stopped. Red Mesa. The letters were small, easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. She pressed her thumb lightly against the spot. 40 years. That was how long it had been since she left. Long enough to build a life somewhere else. Long enough to believe that chapter had closed without needing to be revisited. She folded the map again. Carefully. The same way she had folded the documents. Then she started the engine. The city thinned out gradually. Glass buildings gave way to low structures, then open lots, then stretches of road with fewer signs, fewer exits. The sky widened as she drove, the horizon stretching further with each mile. Evelyn kept both hands on the wheel. 10 and 2. A habit she had never let go of. The radio stayed off. The silence felt cleaner that way. She drove for hours without stopping. The road carried her east, the heat pressing against the windows, the light shifting slowly as the afternoon wore on. Gas stations appeared and disappeared. Small towns passed in quiet blurs, places she didn't recognize and didn't try to. At some point, the landscape changed. Subtle at first. The ground flattened, the colors dulled, the greens faded into dry browns and pale dust. Low shrubs replaced trees. The air outside seemed thinner, even through the glass. She rolled the window down an inch. Warm air slipped inside, carrying the faint smell of earth and something older, something she couldn't quite name, but didn't need to. She had known it once. She stopped once for gas. A small station just off the highway, the kind with a single pump island and a store that sold more dust than anything else. The attendant didn't speak much, just nodded when she handed him her card. Evelyn stood beside the car while the tank filled, watching the road stretch out ahead. A truck passed slowly, tires kicking up a thin trail behind it. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then fell quiet. She didn't check her phone, didn't look at the time. None of it felt urgent anymore. When the pump clicked, she replaced the nozzle and got back in the car without lingering. The sun was lower when she saw the sign. It stood slightly crooked at the edge of the road, paint faded but still readable. Red Mesa. Population, 1,842. Evelyn slowed without thinking. The numbers hadn't changed, or maybe they had, and no one had bothered to update them. She turned off the highway. The road narrowed. The pavement showed its age, Cracks, patches, places where repairs had been made and forgotten. The town came into view slowly, not all at once, just pieces. A closed gas station with boarded windows, a diner with a flickering sign, a row of small houses set back from the road, each one carrying its own kind of quiet. Evelyn drove through it at a steady pace. No one stopped her. No one waved. A man sat on a bench outside what used to be a hardware store, his hat pulled low, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the street. He didn't look up as she passed. It felt smaller than she remembered, not just in size, in sound, in movement. As if time had slowed here without telling anyone. She turned onto a narrower street near the edge of town. The houses grew further apart. The land opened up again, stretching out behind them in long, dry lines. The road turned to gravel for a short stretch before leveling out again. And then she saw it. The house. It stood exactly where it always had, slightly off the road, set back behind a short stretch of yard that had once been green. Now it was mostly dry earth with patches of stubborn grass pushing through. The porch leaned just a little to the left. The paint had faded unevenly, worn by years of sun and wind. One of the shutters hung slightly off its hinge. The screen door, still there. Evelyn slowed the car, then stopped. She didn't get out right away, just sat there, engine idling, looking at it. It hadn't changed as much as she expected. Or maybe it had changed exactly as much as it should have. She turned the engine off. The sudden quiet settled around her. No traffic, no distant hum of the city, just the faint sound of wind moving across the open land. Evelyn opened the door. The ground felt firm beneath her feet, dry, familiar in a way she hadn't prepared for. She closed the door behind her and walked toward the house. Each step stirred a small cloud of dust. The porch creaked as she stepped onto it. Same sound, same place. She reached for the screen door and pulled it open. The hinge protested with a long, familiar squeal. Inside, the air was still. Cooler than outside, but heavy. It carried the scent of old wood, cedar, and something faintly metallic. Time settled into the walls. Evelyn stepped in slowly. The light filtered through the windows in thin, angled lines, catching dust in the air. The furniture was still there, covered in sheets, outlined in shapes she recognized without needing to see clearly. She set her bag down near the door. The floor beneath her feet felt solid. That surprised her. She walked further in, her hand brushing lightly along the edge of a table as she passed. The surface beneath the dust was smooth, unchanged. This wasn't a beginning. She knew that. It wasn't even a return in the way people talked about returning home. It was something else, something quieter. Evelyn stood in the center of the room and let the silence settle around her. There was nowhere else to go. And for now, that was enough. The first night passed without much sleep. Evelyn lay on the narrow bed in what used to be her room, staring at the ceiling where faint cracks traced lines she almost recognized. The mattress was older than she remembered, firmer in places, uneven in others. Every time she shifted, the springs responded with a soft complaint. The house made sounds she had forgotten. Wood settling. Wind brushing against the siding. A loose panel somewhere near the kitchen tapping lightly, then stopping. She kept her eyes open through most of it. Not anxious. Not afraid. Just awake. When the sky outside the window began to pale, she sat up without hesitation. Her body still moved on old habits. Years of waking before sunrise hadn't left her. She swung her feet to the floor. Cold. Solid. Real. The morning came in quietly. Light moved through the house in slow, angled strips, cutting across dust and furniture and surfaces that hadn't been touched in years. Evelyn stood in the kitchen, hands resting on the edge of the counter, looking at the sink. She turned the faucet. For a second, nothing. Then a cough of air, a sputter, and finally, a thin, steady stream of water. She watched it run longer than necessary. Just to be sure. By mid-morning, she had already started. There was no plan, just the next thing. She opened cabinets. One by one. The hinges creaked. The smell inside was dry and faintly stale, like paper left too long in a closed box. Old dishes sat where they had always been. Cups, plates, a chipped bowl she remembered using as a child. She washed them slowly, carefully. The water ran warm now. The sound of it filled the room in a steady rhythm. She dried each piece and placed it back in the cabinet, aligned, evenly spaced. Order. Even if it was small. The rest of the day followed the same pattern. She moved from room to room, lifting sheets off furniture, opening windows just enough to let air move through, sweeping the floor with a broom she found in the back closet, its bristles worn but still holding shape. Dust rose in thin clouds with each pass. She didn't rush. There was no reason to. Each motion was deliberate, measured. By the time the sun dipped lower, the main room looked, not new but clearer, like something that had been forgotten had been acknowledged again. Evelyn stood in the doorway and looked at it. Then she turned away. The nights were the hardest. Not because of fear, because of quiet. The kind that didn't just sit in the room, but pressed in from every direction. She lay in bed again that second night, eyes closed this time, but not asleep. Fragments of memory came and went without warning. A classroom. Rows of desks, students shifting in their seats. The sound of her own voice, steady, confident. Then another memory. A conference room. A man across from her, leaning forward, explaining something with calm certainty. Numbers written on a board. Plans laid out step by step. She didn't stay with that one long. Her eyes opened. The ceiling was still there. Unchanged. By the third day, her hands had started to ache. A dull, persistent soreness in her fingers, her wrists. She noticed it when she tried to open a jar she had found in the pantry. The lid resisted, then gave with a sharp twist that made her wince slightly. She set it down and flexed her hand, then continued. There was always something else to do. A loose hinge on the back door. She found a screwdriver in the shed. Rusted, but usable. The metal was rough in her grip. She tightened the screws carefully, one at a time, until the door sat properly in its frame again. It wasn't perfect, but it held. That afternoon, she noticed the dog. At first, it was just movement, a shape at the edge of the yard. Evelyn stood still on the porch, one hand resting lightly against the doorframe. The sun sat high, casting sharp shadows across the dry ground. The air carried that same faint, dusty scent. The dog stood near the far edge of the property. A border collie mix from the look of it. Black and white coat, though dulled with dirt and time. Thin but not starving. Its ears were alert, its posture still. It wasn't approaching, just watching. Evelyn didn't move toward it, didn't call out. She simply stood there. The dog held its position for a few seconds longer, then turned and disappeared beyond the low rise of land. Gone as quietly as it had appeared. It came back the next day. Same place, same distance. Evelyn noticed it again while sweeping the porch. The soft scrape of the broom against wood paused as she lifted her head. There it was, watching. She leaned the broom against the wall and stepped forward just enough to stand at the edge of the porch. Still, she said nothing. The dog shifted its weight slightly, but didn't retreat this time. Just stood there, eyes steady. After a moment, Evelyn turned back to her work. She finished sweeping, carried the dustpan inside, closed the door. Days began to blend together. Morning. Work. Evening. Sleep. Or something close to it. Evelyn didn't think about what came next. She didn't think about what had already happened. She focused on what was in front of her. A cabinet. A floor. A door. Something broken. Something that could be made usable again. It wasn't purpose. Not yet. But it was something that filled the hours. On the 5th day, the dog came closer. Not much. Just a few steps beyond where it had stood before. Evelyn noticed it from the kitchen window this time. She paused with a dish in her hand, water running over her fingers, and looked out. The dog stood near the fence line, closer than before. Its head tilted slightly as if trying to understand her. Evelyn dried her hands slowly and stepped outside. The heat wrapped around her again, familiar now. She walked down the porch steps, one step at a time. The dog didn't run. It watched her. Evelyn stopped halfway across the yard. That was enough. They stood there for a long moment, neither moving, neither forcing anything. Finally, Evelyn turned back toward the house. Inside, she found a small piece of bread in the kitchen. She stepped out again and placed it on the ground near the edge of the porch. Then she went back inside without looking. From the window, she watched. The dog waited. A minute. 2. Then it moved, careful, measured. It approached the bread, lowered its head, and picked it up quickly before stepping back again. It didn't eat right away, just held it, watching the house. Evelyn stepped away from the window. She didn't need to see the rest. That night, the quiet felt slightly different. Not louder, not softer, just shared. Somewhere outside, the dog settled into the dark, close enough to be part of the space, far enough not to intrude. Evelyn lay in bed, her eyes closing sooner this time. The house still made its sounds. The wind still moved along the walls, but something had shifted. Not enough to name, just enough to notice. The feeling stayed with her the next morning. It didn't interrupt anything. She still woke early, still moved through the house the same way. Quiet, deliberate, one task leading into the next. But somewhere underneath it all, there was a faint shift, like something slightly out of place in a room you knew well, even if you couldn't point to it yet. Evelyn stood at the kitchen table with a stack of papers she had pulled from a narrow drawer the night before. Old documents, receipts, bills, folded envelopes with softened edges. Her mother had never thrown much away. Not the important things, anyway. Everything had been kept in small piles tucked into corners, filed in ways that made sense to her alone. Evelyn had started sorting them without much thought. Just another task, another way to move the day forward. She picked up the first envelope. Utility bill, years old. She set it aside. The next, insurance notice, expired. Another, Property tax statement. She paused there for a moment, scanning the numbers, the dates. Everything seemed in order, nothing unexpected. She moved on. The stack grew thinner. The room stayed quiet except for the soft sound of paper shifting against wood. Then her hand slowed. It was just a receipt. Small, narrow, printed on thin paper that had faded slightly over time. At first glance it looked like nothing, but her fingers didn't move it right away. Instead, she read it, then read it again. A payment. Automatic withdrawal. The amount wasn't large, but it was precise. Too precise. She turned the paper slightly, angling it toward the light coming through the window. The company name sat near the top. Unfamiliar. She didn't recognize it. That, in itself, wasn't unusual. Her mother had handled her own finances for years. There were bound to be things Evelyn hadn't seen. But something about it didn't sit right. She reached for another paper from the pile, then another. Her movements slowed. More receipts. More statements. And then there it was again. Same company name. Same format. Different date. She set both papers side by side on the table. The amounts were identical. Not rounded. Not estimated. Exact. Her eyes moved to the dates. Months apart. Then she reached for another, and another. The same pattern. Spread out over time. Not frequent enough to draw attention. Not large enough to raise concern. But consistent. Carefully so. Evelyn sat down. The chair scraped lightly against the floor as she pulled it closer to the table. She leaned forward, elbows resting near the edge, and began arranging the papers. One by one. In order. Her mind moved quietly, the way it always had when something needed to be understood. Not rushed. Not distracted. Just steady. The dates stretched further back than she expected. Years. Not recent, not new. This had been happening for a long time. She reached for a pen. It was the same one she had been using since she arrived, kept in her coat pocket out of habit. She clicked it once, then lowered the tip to the paper. Carefully, she circled the company name. The ink stood out sharply against the faded print. She tapped the pen lightly against the table. Once. Twice. The sound was soft, but it carried in the quiet room. Her mother had lived here alone for years, handled everything herself, paid what needed to be paid. But this, Evelyn leaned back slightly in the chair. Her eyes moved across the table again, taking in the arrangement she had made. There was nothing dramatic about it. No sudden realization, just a quiet, persistent question. Why? She stood and moved toward the cabinet near the sink. Inside, more papers. Folders this time. Older. She pulled one out and carried it back to the table, set it down, opened it. Inside were bank statements, monthly summaries. She flipped through them slowly, her fingers careful not to tear the thin pages. Her eyes scanned the columns. Numbers, withdrawals, deposits. Then she found it. There, the same company name, listed among the transactions. Again and again. Each entry small enough to disappear into the page, unless you were looking for it. Evelyn lowered herself back into the chair. Her breathing remained steady, but her focus sharpened. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't random. It was intentional, quietly maintained over time. She reached for the earliest statement in the folder, flipped to the back, checked the date. Her brow tightened slightly. The timeline didn't match what she remembered. Her mother had slowed down in her final years, delegated less, but simplified more. Fewer accounts, fewer moving parts. This didn't fit that pattern. If anything, it suggested the opposite. Consistency, attention, planning. Evelyn gathered the papers into a single stack and aligned the edges carefully. Then she placed them flat on the table, one hand resting lightly on top. The house remained still around her. The faint creak of wood, the distant sound of wind moving across open land. Nothing had changed. And yet, she looked down at the circled name again. Something had. Not in the house, not outside, but here, in this quiet detail that didn't belong. Evelyn lifted the pen once more and underlined the name. Slowly, deliberately. Then she set the pen down beside the papers and sat there for a moment longer. Not confused, not overwhelmed, just aware. There was something here, and she wasn't going to ignore it. Evelyn didn't rush. That had never been her way. Not in the classroom, not in meetings, and not now. She gathered the papers into a neat stack, tapped them once against the table to align the edges, and slid them into a worn folder she found in the bottom drawer. The motion felt familiar, controlled. Then she stood, reached for her coat, and slipped it on. The morning air outside was already warming. The sun sat higher than she expected, casting sharp light across the yard. The dog, still lingering, lifted its head from the shade near the porch, but didn't move as she stepped past. Evelyn paused for a second. "You staying?" she asked quietly. The dog didn't answer, of course, but it didn't leave. That seemed enough. The bank sat at the edge of town, a low building with a faded sign and a parking lot that had more empty spaces than cars. Evelyn parked near the front and turned off the engine. She sat for a moment, the folder resting on the passenger seat. Then she picked it up and stepped out. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and old carpet. A ceiling fan turned slowly overhead, moving the air without much effect. Behind the counter, a woman in her late 50s looked up from a computer screen. There was a flicker of recognition, not strong, but present. "You need help?" the woman asked. Evelyn approached the counter, placing the folder gently in front of her. "I'm trying to track some transactions," she said, "from my mother's account, older records." The woman nodded slowly, her eyes dropping to the folder. Name, Margaret Harper. That seemed to settle something. The woman's posture softened just a little. "All right," she said, reaching for a keyboard. "Let's see what we can find." It took time. More than Evelyn expected. Old systems, archived files, records that weren't immediately available. The woman, her name turned out to be Linda, worked quietly, asking only what she needed to. Dates, approximate years, anything that might narrow it down. Evelyn answered carefully. She didn't guess, didn't assume. When she didn't know, she said so. Eventually, Linda leaned back slightly, eyes still on the screen. "I can pull partial statements," she said. "Not everything, but enough to give you a picture. That's fine." The printer behind the counter whirred to life. Paper slid out in slow, steady intervals. Evelyn watched each page as it appeared. Lines of numbers, transactions, withdrawals. And there it was again. The same company name, repeated, consistent, quiet. Linda gathered the pages and slid them across the counter. "Anything specific you're looking for?" she asked. Evelyn hesitated, just briefly. Then she shook her head, just trying to understand. Linda gave a small nod, as if that answer made more sense than anything else. "Well," she said, "if you need more, you can come back. We'll do what we can." Evelyn thanked her and stepped outside. The sun felt sharper now, brighter. The air carried that same dry weight, pressing gently against everything. Evelyn didn't go home. Not yet. Instead, she crossed the street toward the county office. The building was older, brick worn along the edges. A flag out front moved lazily in the breeze. Inside, the air was cooler, but carried a different kind of stillness. This place held things. Records. Histories. Details no one thought about until they had to. A man sat behind a desk near the back, reading something with a pair of glasses low on his nose. He looked up as she approached. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for property records," Evelyn said. "Something outside town. I have a name, but I'm not sure where to start." The man studied her for a second, then gestured toward a side room. "Back there. Files are organized by parcel. If you've got something specific, it'll take some digging." Evelyn nodded. "That's all right." The room smelled like paper and dust. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with folders that had been handled, moved, and returned countless times over the years. A single window let in a narrow beam of light that cut across the center of the room. Evelyn stepped inside, closed the door behind her, and began. She worked methodically, starting with what she knew. The company name, the dates. She pulled files, opened them, read, returned them, then pulled another. Time passed without much notice. The room stayed quiet, the only sound the soft movement of paper and the occasional creak of the shelves. At some point, she found it. Not immediately obvious, not labeled in a way that drew attention. But there, a reference. A parcel number tied to the company name. She traced it back through the records, following the connections one step at a time. Her fingers moved steadily across the pages, her eyes scanning for patterns, for anything that linked one piece to another. And slowly, it came together. The payments weren't random. They were tied to something specific. A piece of land. Outside town. Not large, not developed, not mentioned anywhere in the documents she had seen at the house. Evelyn leaned back slightly, the folder open in her hands. This wasn't an oversight. It had been left out. Deliberately. She closed the file and held it for a moment, her thumb resting against the edge. Then she stood and returned it to its place on the shelf. When she stepped back outside, the light had shifted. Late afternoon now. Longer shadows. The town looked the same. Quiet. Unchanged. But Evelyn felt the difference. Not in the place, in herself. She walked back to her car, the folder tucked under her arm. The dog was waiting when she got home. Closer this time. It stood near the porch, watching her as she pulled into the yard. Evelyn turned off the engine and stepped out. The dog didn't move away. She closed the door and walked toward the house. Halfway up the path, she stopped. The dog held her gaze. Evelyn looked at it for a second, then gave a small nod, almost to herself. "I found something," she said quietly. The dog tilted its head slightly, as if listening. Evelyn continued past it and stepped onto the porch. Inside, she placed the folder on the table, opened it, and looked at the papers again. The parcel number. The location. A place she had never heard of. Or maybe had. a long time ago. Before she left, she ran her finger lightly along the line of text. Outside, the wind moved across the dry land, carrying dust in thin, shifting patterns. Evelyn stood there, the room quiet around her, the papers spread out before her. The trail had started, and now it had somewhere to go. Evelyn didn't wait until morning. She stood at the table a while longer, studying the parcel number, tracing the printed coordinates with her finger as if the paper itself might offer more than it already had. The room had grown dim without her noticing. The light outside had shifted into that thin, amber hour when everything looked softer than it really was. She folded the papers carefully and slid them back into the folder. Then reached for her keys. The road out of town was quieter than before. Fewer houses, less movement. The pavement gave way to a narrower stretch that looked like it hadn't been repaired in years. Dust lifted behind the car in a low, steady cloud as she drove. She followed the directions as best she could. There were no clear signs. Just distances, turns that weren't marked. Land that stretched out without boundaries. At one point, she slowed the car and leaned forward slightly, scanning the horizon. The land looked the same in every direction, flat, dry, interrupted only by low brush and the occasional fence line that seemed to exist without purpose. She checked the paper again, adjusted slightly, then continued. By the time she stopped, the sun had dropped lower, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground. Evelyn turned off the engine. The silence settled in immediately. No distant traffic. No voices. Just the wind. It moved across the land in slow, steady passes, brushing against dry grass and loose dirt, carrying a faint, hollow sound that echoed across the open space. She stepped out of the car. The ground felt firm beneath her shoes. Dry. Packed. She closed the door behind her and stood still for a moment, taking in the space. There was nothing obvious. No structure. No marker that clearly said this was the place. Just land. Empty, as far as anyone passing by would be concerned. Evelyn walked forward. Each step stirred a small shift of dust beneath her feet. The air smelled faintly of sun-warmed earth, dry and quiet. She moved slowly. Not wandering. Looking. Her eyes scanned the ground, the lines of the terrain, the way the land rose and fell in subtle ways that might have gone unnoticed before. Something about it felt uneven. Not in a way that stood out, but enough to hold her attention. She stopped. There. A faint line in the dirt. So faint, she almost missed it. It didn't follow the natural patterns of erosion. It cut across the ground at an angle that didn't quite belong. Evelyn stepped closer, lowered herself slightly, her knees bending as she leaned down to get a better look. Her fingers brushed against the surface. Dust shifted, revealing just a little more. The line continued. Straight, deliberate. She followed it with her eyes, tracing its path across a short stretch of ground until it ended near a patch of slightly darker soil. Evelyn moved toward it. The wind picked up briefly, pushing a thin layer of dust across the surface, but not enough to hide what she had already seen. She knelt. Her hand pressed into the ground. Firm. Not recently disturbed, but not entirely natural either. She brushed away the top layer of dirt. Once. Twice. Her fingers slowed. Something solid met her touch. Not rock. Smoother. Flatter. She cleared more dirt away with the side of her hand. The shape began to form. A metal surface. Worn. Edges softened by time, but unmistakably placed. Evelyn sat back slightly, her breath steady, her movements controlled. She reached for a small piece of broken wood nearby and used it to scrape away more of the dirt. The object revealed itself slowly. A plate. Rectangular. Set into the ground. Partially buried, but not by accident. She wiped the surface with her palm. The dust came away in streaks, revealing faint lettering beneath. It was hard to read at first. Faded. Weathered. But still there. The same company name. The one she had circled. The one she had followed all the way here. Evelyn didn't move for a long moment. The wind passed over her, lifting strands of her hair, pressing lightly against her coat. She looked out across the land again. Nothing had changed. Still empty. Still quiet. But now she knew better. She leaned forward again, this time more carefully. Her fingers traced the edges of the metal plate. It wasn't loose. It was set. Deliberately. Connected to something beneath. The realization came slowly. Not as a shock. More like a shift in perspective. What she had thought was empty wasn't. It had been hidden. Behind her, she heard a soft movement. Evelyn turned her head. The dog stood a few yards away. Closer than before. Its posture was alert, but not tense. It had followed her without her noticing, standing now at the edge of the space as if it understood something had changed. Evelyn looked at it for a second, then back at the plate. "You see it too," she said quietly. The dog didn't move, just watched. Evelyn stood slowly, brushing the dirt from her hands. Her mind moved through what she had found. The payments, the records, the land. All of it leading here. But this wasn't just paperwork anymore. This was something real, something physical, something her mother had been connected to and never mentioned. She stepped back from the plate and looked around again, this time with a different kind of attention. The land wasn't empty. It was quiet. There was a difference. The sun dipped lower. The light shifted again, turning the ground into long stretches of shadow and gold. Evelyn knew she didn't have enough light left to do more. Not today. She took one last look at the metal plate, memorizing its position, the way the ground curved slightly around it, the way the faint line connected back across the dirt. Then she turned toward the car. The dog followed this time, not close, but not distant either. Just there. The drive back felt shorter, or maybe her attention had shifted. The road was the same. The town unchanged, but something had opened. A question that had shape now. A direction. When she pulled into the yard, the sky had deepened into evening. She turned off the engine and sat for a moment, hands resting on the wheel. The image of the metal plate stayed with her. Clear. Unmistakable. Evelyn stepped out of the car. The dog moved ahead of her, then paused near the porch, waiting. She walked up the steps, opened the door, and stepped inside. The house felt different. Not warmer, not brighter, but less. Closed. She set the folder on the table and stood there, looking at it. The trail hadn't ended. It had just changed. And whatever her mother had left behind, It was still out there, waiting. Evelyn didn't sleep much that night. Not because she was restless, because her mind had something to hold now. A shape, a direction, something real enough to return to. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling again, but this time the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt occupied, filled with small, steady thoughts that didn't need to rush. The metal plate, the name, the land, all of it sitting just beneath the surface of everything she had known about her mother. And not known. She was up before sunrise. The house still cool from the night air, the light barely beginning to push through the edges of the windows. She moved through the kitchen without turning on the overhead light, her hands finding what they needed without searching. Coffee. Black. Simple. She stood by the sink while it brewed, watching the faint reflection of the yard in the glass. The dog was there, curled near the porch. It lifted its head slightly when it sensed movement inside, then settled again. It hadn't left. Evelyn poured the coffee into a chipped mug and took it to the table. The folder sat exactly where she had left it. She opened it, carefully. The papers inside felt different now. Not just documents, not just records. Clues. She pulled out the bank statements again, laying them flat across the table. Her eyes moved over the transactions, but she wasn't just reading them anymore. She was comparing. Dates. Patterns. Amounts. Her mind worked through it the way it had for years. Quiet, methodical, patient. She noticed something she hadn't seen before. The timing. The payments weren't random. They aligned. Not with bills, not with anything routine, but with something else. Intervals, structured, deliberate. Evelyn leaned back slightly, the mug warm in her hands. This wasn't someone paying into a service. This was someone maintaining something. By mid-morning, she was back in town. The library sat near the center, a low building with wide windows that let in more light than most places around it. The door opened with a soft chime as she stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of paper and polish. Rows of shelves stretched quietly into the back, filled with books that hadn't moved much in years. A woman sat behind the front desk, reading. She looked up briefly, offered a small nod, then returned to her page. Evelyn didn't need help. She knew what she was looking for, or at least where to start. The local archives were kept in the back corner. Old newspapers, town records, community reports. She pulled a chair up to one of the long tables and began. The company name again. That was her anchor. She searched through directories first, then business listings, then older records, documents that had been printed, filed, and mostly forgotten. Time passed. Quietly. She didn't notice how long she had been there until the light shifted again, the sun moving across the windows in slow arcs. Then she found it. Not in a headline, not in anything obvious. A small mention. Buried in a local report from decades ago. A cooperative project. Energy. Rural infrastructure. The name matched. Exactly. Evelyn leaned forward, her hand resting lightly against the paper. She read it again and again. The details were sparse, but enough. The company wasn't private, not entirely. It had been part of something larger. A small group, local. People pooling resources for something that hadn't been fully understood at the time, or maybe it had been. just not widely. She pulled more records, followed the references, each one leading to another. And then, there it was. A document. Older than the others. A list of names. Founding members. Evelyn's eyes moved down the page slowly, not expecting anything, just reading. Then they stopped. Margaret Harper. Her mother. The name sat there as plainly as any other. No emphasis. No explanation. Just listed among the others. Evelyn didn't move. Her hand remained where it was, her fingers lightly touching the edge of the page. Her mother hadn't just been involved. She had been there at the beginning. The realization didn't come all at once. It unfolded. Quietly. Layer by layer, the payments, the land, the plate. All of it connected to something her mother had helped build, something she had maintained and never spoken about. Evelyn leaned back in the chair. The room remained still around her. A few pages turned somewhere in the distance. A chair shifted, the soft hum of the building holding its own quiet. She looked down at the document again, at the name. Margaret Harper. Her mother had never mentioned any of this. Not once, not in passing, not in the quiet conversations they had shared over the years, nothing. Evelyn tried to remember, to pull something from the past that might have hinted at it. A conversation, a detail, anything. But there was nothing. Or if there had been, it had been too small to notice at the time. She gathered the papers slowly, made copies where she could, took notes in the margins of a notebook she found at the desk. Her handwriting remained steady, clear, each piece fitting into place as she moved forward. This wasn't confusion anymore. It was direction. When she stepped back outside, the light had softened again. The air carried a faint breeze, enough to move the dust along the street in slow patterns. Evelyn stood for a moment on the steps of the library. The town looked the same. Quiet. Unchanged. But she saw it differently now. Every place held something beneath it, something not immediately visible. The drive back felt quieter. Not because the world had changed, because her attention had. The land stretched out on either side of the road, the same as before. But now it felt connected. Not empty. Not forgotten. Just waiting. When she pulled into the yard, the dog was already there. Closer than before. Sitting near the steps, its posture relaxed but alert. Evelyn stepped out of the car. The dog stood. Waited. She walked toward the porch, stopped halfway, looked at it. "My mother knew," she said quietly. The dog tilted its head slightly. Evelyn exhaled, not heavily, just enough to release the words into the air. She knew what was out there. The dog didn't move, didn't need to. Evelyn nodded once, then continued to the porch. Inside, she set the papers on the table and stood there, looking at them. The room felt smaller now, not confined, just more defined. She knew something now she hadn't known before, something her mother had chosen not to say. And that choice, that silence, meant something. Evelyn placed her hand lightly on the top page, then slowly pulled it away. Whatever had been hidden, it wasn't an accident. It had been left that way. For a reason. Evelyn stood at the table longer than she realized, her hand resting near the edge of the papers without touching them. The room felt quieter than before, not because the sounds had changed, but because her understanding had. Her mother hadn't forgotten. She hadn't overlooked anything. She had chosen silence. Evelyn turned away from the table and walked slowly to the window. The late afternoon light stretched across the yard, long and low, casting the dog's shadow almost twice its size as it rested near the porch. The land beyond looked the same, but it wasn't. Not anymore. That night, she pulled out a different set of documents. Not her mother's. Her own. They had been sitting at the bottom of her bag since the day she left Phoenix, folded, handled too many times, edges worn from being opened and closed in quiet moments she hadn't wanted to fully face. She set them on the table, smoothed them flat. The same careful motion, the same attention to detail. Only now she looked at them differently. The investment agreements, the early proposals. Pages filled with numbers, projections, and language that had once made perfect sense. Evelyn sat down and leaned forward, her elbows resting lightly on the table as she began to read. Not quickly, not the way she had before, trusting the structure, trusting the explanation. Now, she read as if every word had weight. She traced lines, compared terms. Let her eyes move slowly across each section. And then she saw it. Not immediately, not in bold, but there, a reference. Small, almost buried in a paragraph describing future expansion opportunities. The name, the same company, the one from the receipts, the one from the land. Evelyn didn't react outwardly. Her hand didn't jerk. Her breath didn't catch. But something inside her shifted, quietly, firmly. She leaned closer. Read the line again, then again. The proposal had mentioned regional infrastructure, potential partnerships, land access. Nothing specific, nothing direct, but the connection was there. Subtle, intentional. Evelyn reached for another page, then another. Her movements stayed calm, but her focus sharpened. She began comparing dates, the investment timeline, the payments her mother had made. The development phases outlined in the documents. They overlapped. Not perfectly, but enough. Enough to form a pattern. She sat back slowly, her hands resting in her lap. The room felt still around her, the kind of stillness that settles after something has been understood, even if it hasn't been fully processed. Her colleague's face came to mind. Not clearly, just fragments. The way he had spoken. Confident, measured, never rushed. He had explained everything, answered every question, given her time to think. And she had. She hadn't been careless. She had reviewed, considered, weighed the risks. But she hadn't known this. This part, this connection. Evelyn stood and walked toward the sink, resting her hands lightly against the edge. She looked out the window again. The sky had darkened slightly, the first hints of evening settling in. The dog had shifted closer to the porch, not right at the steps, but near enough to be part of the space. She watched it for a moment, then looked back at the reflection in the glass. Her own face, calm, steady, unchanged in expression, but something beneath that had moved. The loss hadn't been random. That much was clear now. It hadn't been a simple mistake, or bad timing. There had been information she didn't have, something known, something used, not against her necessarily, but not shared. And that absence, that gap, had shaped everything. Evelyn returned to the table. She gathered the documents again, separating her mother's papers from her own. 2 stacks, side by side, past and present. unconnected before. Now, overlapping. She aligned the edges carefully, then placed her hand on top of both stacks at once, holding them there, feeling the weight of it. Not heavy, just real. Outside, the wind moved again, brushing against the house with a soft, steady sound. The same as before, unchanged, but she heard it differently now. Evelyn exhaled slowly and pulled her hand back. She wasn't angry. Not in the way people expected anger to feel. There was no heat. No urgency. Just clarity. The kind that didn't ask for reaction. Only decision. She walked to the door and stepped outside. The air had cooled slightly, the edge of the day giving way to evening. The sky stretched wide above the land, fading from gold to a deeper blue. The dog stood as she approached, not backing away, not moving forward, just waiting. Evelyn stopped a few steps from it, looked down. "You knew this place better than I did," she said quietly. The dog's ears shifted slightly. Evelyn nodded once, not to the dog, to herself. She looked out across the land again, toward the direction she had driven earlier, toward the place where the ground wasn't what it seemed. There was more there. She knew that now. Not just physically, but in the way everything connected. Her mother. The payments. The silence. And now her own loss. Evelyn turned back toward the house. The door creaked softly as she opened it. Inside, the papers waited, the same as she had left them, but no longer just records. Now they were evidence, not of what had been taken, but of what had been missed. She sat down once more, the chair steady beneath her, the table solid, her hands resting lightly against the surface. For the first time since the office in Phoenix, she didn't feel like she was reacting. She felt like she was looking at something from the outside, seeing its shape, its edges, where it had come from, and where it might go. Evelyn reached for the folder again, opened it, and began organizing everything. Not hurried, not tense, just deliberate. The truth hadn't undone anything. It hadn't changed what had already happened, but it had changed something else, something quieter. Something she hadn't felt since before everything had collapsed. A sense that there was still something left to understand. And more importantly, something left to decide. Evelyn sat there a long time, the papers spread out in front of her, the quiet of the house settling around her, like it had every night since she came back. But this time, it wasn't empty. Her eyes moved between the two stacks, her mother's careful, quiet work, and her own loss, laid out in clean, official language. For days, they had felt like separate stories, two lives that didn't quite touch. Now they did. And it changed everything. She thought about how she had spent years trusting what was spoken out loud. Plans, numbers, promises that came neatly explained. She had measured her life by what made sense on paper. But her mother had built something no one talked about, maintained it without asking to be seen, left it behind without ever explaining why. Evelyn let out a slow breath. Outside, the dog shifted closer to the steps. It had never asked permission, never needed to understand the details. It just stayed where something real was. That was the difference. Not everything important comes with a clear explanation. Some things are only found when you stop looking where everyone else told you to look. Evelyn reached for the folder again, not to close it, but to keep going. Because for the first time, she wasn't trying to recover what she had lost. She was following something that had been waiting for her long before that. And as she stood, stepping out onto the porch, feeling the dry evening air settle around her, she realized, if something this important had been hidden in plain sight her whole life, what else had she walked past, simply because it didn't look like what she expected?